Hi guys, this is Dr. Gonzalez here, and in today's video I'm going to talk to you about institutional review boards. Institutional review boards are often referred to as IRBs. You'll hear researchers refer to IRB review, and IRBs are an important part of the research process whenever we are talking about research that is involving human subjects. So let's talk about it. So first of all, what is an IRB? IRB itself stands for Institutional Review Board, and it's this entity that exists out there that is charged with looking over and reviewing the ethical and regulatory oversight of any research that uses human subjects. What exactly are they looking at? They are looking at the risks to make sure that they are minimized as much as possible. They're going to make sure that treatment of their participants is ethical and that participants are ethically respected following the principles of several different things, including the Belmont Review. Or the Belmont Report, sorry. They're also going to look at the informed consent, the process, the form, and they're going to judge whether or not that's appropriate. They're going to weigh the study's possible benefits, compare it to the possible risks to make sure that the benefits justify any risks that are going to be taken. And they're also going to make sure that that registered researcher is going to follow any federal, state, or institutional guidelines that are necessary. We have federal guidelines that oversee all of us. Certain state guidelines have to do with the particular state where the research is taking place. And then different institutions might have different guidelines as well. So an IRB is going to review any research that has to do with humans, human participants. We'll call those human subjects. And the IRB is going to make sure that that study is protecting the participants' rights, their safety, their privacy, and their welfare. And one thing that you have to remember is that if a study requires IRB approval, it has to be obtained before research begins. And it may also continue to monitor that research as long as it is continuing to collect data. So it's not just a one and done deal. So how did the IRB come to belong in the research world? Well, the IRB itself was born from the Belmont Report. You remember the Belmont Report focused on 3 ethical principles. That was respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Who makes up the IRB? Well, the IRB is a committee, and it's made up of appointed members, and those members have different training in different areas. So the IRB is going to have people from different diverse backgrounds. So, for example, this class that we're talking about, research methods, we're talking about research that's been conducted through the psychology department, right? Well, you might also have researchers in medicine or researchers in kinesiology, or maybe even people in the hard sciences like biology, chemistry, etc., that are using human subjects. So we're going to include researchers from diverse backgrounds because we don't want our committee members to be just from one specific area. It also includes both males and females. At least one person on an IRB should come from an area that is a non-scientific area. I've frequently seen priests or other pastors, religious leaders on the IRB. I've seen teachers. I've seen community members who were simply just interested in being part of the research process, and this was the way that they could do that. And then you also have to have one person who is not affiliated with the institution of the IRB. So, for example, UHCL has an internal IRB committee. One of the members of that committee has to be someone who is not affiliated with UHCL. So that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be a scientist. It could be someone, a doctor, say, from the community, but they are not a professor or related in any professional way with the institution that the IRB is housed at. Why is the diversity important in an IRB committee? Well, it's really important because I explained just a moment ago, this IRB is going to review studies that come from a wide range of research areas. So we want to get a unique perspective from each different member of the committee. So the people that have scientific training are going to be the experts on the study design and the justification of why that research needs to take place. Non-scientific members view things through a different lens, and their opinion is just as valuable. So they may work to help identify other ethical, practical, or communication concerns, and it's simply because everybody's view of research or the world in general is shaped by your own personal lens, right? You see the world through your own eyes, so do the committee members. That unaffiliated member also provides a perspective from outside of the institution. You'll hear people talk about institutional culture, and that culture is a culture that permeates a particular university or a medical center or whatever. So having an outside member gives an additional perspective that we wouldn't see as people employed by the same entity as the IRB. And then there's reason to bring in specialists when necessary. So sometimes the research that's being conducted is specialized in a way that maybe not all of the existing committee members can capture the uniqueness through their perspectives. So there are times when an outside member can be brought in that has that additional expertise with vulnerable populations or special procedures. The diversity on those committees is extremely important because it helps prevent research decisions that are made from only one researcher's point of view. Maybe one researcher has one particular passion and they hyperfixate on that passion, and by having other people come in and participate and give their valuable opinions, the diversity of the viewpoints of the IRB is expanded. And we also don't want the power to rest in one particular person's hands. That could be dangerous as well. So what does an IRB actually do? Well, I told you earlier they were basically existing to make sure that it's ethical, that safety, privacy concerns are there. Let's break that down into some specific talking points. So an IRB is going to consider an application, and that application is going to have a lot of information and a lot of different parts. The information that's in the IRB application packet is going to include the purpose of the research. Why is this research being conducted? And specifically, why is it being conducted in humans? Okay. Remember, if your study is looking at something that has to do with biochemistry and never looks at something with humans, IRB would not be appropriate. At the same time, if you're looking at something that has to do with animals, there's a completely different procedure that we go through. The IRB is also going to look at the study's procedures, what is being done, how the data is being collected. They're going to make sure that that is ethical, safe, etc. They're going to look at recruitment methods. They're going to make sure that those follow the guidelines that we talked about in the Belmont report. They're going to look at the informed consent procedures and the materials because this is a big component. Informed consent is extremely important. Getting someone's consent could also be considered kind of like getting their permission, okay? And for it truly to be informed, the person who is going to participate has to understand what the research entails. That means they've got to have a thorough understanding of the procedures, some of the basic science behind the procedures, and they really need to be able to have enough information to evaluate whether or not they want to participate. So those informed consent procedures are extremely important. And then you're going to sign your informed consent. And that is a legal document. So that actual paper, whether it be on physical paper or a digital version, you've got to make sure that the participants have a copy of it or have the ability to print it out, because it does become a legal document. The IRB committee is also going to look at the risks and benefits. They're also going to examine how the researcher is going to maintain privacy, confidentiality, anonymity, if that is the case, and then how the data is also collected and stored. There are rules about these things. Data has to be kept, and it has to be kept safely for a certain amount of time. And then finally, one of the other things that the IRB is going to consider is, are there any special or vulnerable populations in this research, and how are those populations going to be given additional protection? So how does this relate in specific to experimental design? Because that's what this course is focused on. Well, because there is a manipulation of that independent variable, experimental studies warrant an additional step of crucial review. The IRB might come along and focus on asking questions that are related to the experience of the participant in each condition, who is going to get the treatment and who isn't going to get the treatment, and is that ethical, and is that fair, and is that just? They might also ask how the participants are going to be randomly assigned. They're going to be checking that random assignment component to make sure that there's nothing out of the ordinary with that. They might also check to see whether the control group is treated fairly. I'll give you an example of that from my own personal experience. Back when COVID started, near me there is a professional research group, a company that runs clinical trials for different drug companies, and they were running a clinical trial for the AstraZeneca mRNA vaccine, and I decided to participate in the study. So there was a clause in the informed consent that said, in the event that this vaccination is approved by the FDA for use in general human populations, you could call back in with this ID number and they would tell you if you were in the placebo group or the group that actually got the vaccine. Why would they do that? Because, you know, clinical trials are supposed to be blind, right? Well, they are blind, but because this was talking about a vaccine at a critical moment in a pandemic, they were offering every participant the opportunity to receive the vaccine if and when it was approved for use by everyone else. It would not have been fair for them to have given the vaccine to the control group and then not offered the chance for you to get it after it had been approved. Now, unfortunately, the AstraZeneca vaccination was not approved, so the only way you would have known to call in and ask about that was if you were then able to get a vaccine from another company that was approved. So I was ready to get my vaccination, and I called in and I said, hey, yeah, I know I won't be able to participate anymore, but I've got some high-risk people around me, and I want to make sure that I am protected as much as I can, so I need to unblind myself from the study. And then they notified me that I had been in the vaccination group, so I had already received the vaccine, and then that informed my decision about whether or not I should go get another vaccination, which I ended up doing. Anyway, long story short, the next thing that they're going to evaluate is deception, because if deception is used, there has to be very ample justification for using that deception. And then, as you've known from the other lectures that we've gone through this course, there has to be a thorough and adequate debriefing to explain to the participant why the deception existed in the first place, and then mitigate any possible consequences from that deception. The IRB is also going to look to see if participants can withdraw from the study, how they can withdraw from the study, and if there is a penalty. We cannot impose penalties because consent to participate in these research studies has to be voluntary. And then the final thing they may evaluate and ask is, are the risks reasonable compared to the potential benefits? We're not going to allow research studies that are risky to take place if there is no benefit at all. So the IRB review is required in general when a project involves research with human participants. So research is defined as a systematic investigation designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge, and human participants are individuals from which data is collected via interaction, intervention, or identifiable private information in living people. So you'll notice here, observation was kind of left off, and we'll talk about that down the road in just a moment. And then living was also important. So studies that don't require living participants. So postmortem studies, studies after people have passed away, like donating your body for science or blood, those things do not require IRB approval in general. So usually you're going to need IRB review before any data is collected. That's usually my point in expressing when an IRB is used. So that includes before you start recruiting people, because in order to recruit them, you have to have recruitment materials, and those recruitment materials are going to be reviewed by the IRB. Obviously, you need review before you collect data. If you're not collecting data directly from the participants, and say you're using some sort of database of previous data, you have to have IRB approval before you access that previously collected data. And then also, same thing, analyzing identifiable private information. So perhaps you are doing a study with medical records. The medical records have already been collected. They're already existing there, but they include private identifiable information. Before you can take them and identify them, you still need IRB approval. So the bottom line is, if you're concerned about whether or not your research requires IRB approval, you need to ask, because it has to be acquired, and it's not something that is quick and can be done overnight. It's a very long and detailed process, as it should be. So not everything requires an IRB, okay? So here's some situations when it wouldn't. If we decided to collect some general data from ourselves in this class right now, some very generic, unidentifiable data for classroom learning, that wouldn't require an IRB. If I'm not going to contribute that data to the body of generalizable knowledge, it doesn't require an IRB, which that kind of goes against the principles of research, right? You're doing research to contribute your information, your outcome to the body of knowledge. If you're going to publish it, it has to go through IRB, right? If that data is not going to be shared outside of the course, you wouldn't have to worry about that then. If I'm using a fully anonymous public database, so for example, there are several surveys that the CDC does every few years. Like there's one about youth risk factors. The BRFIS, I think is what it's called. It starts with a B. It'd have to go behavioral risk, something. It starts with a B though. Anyway, that data does not have any identifiable private information. It's already been collected by somebody else, and it exists out there as a database. So that data, if you're using something like that, you would not need IRB approval. And then there's a generic statement down here about doesn't use identifiable private information. Almost everything I know of that exists out there does, except for these specialized databases. So you, the researcher, can't decide on your own. You need to find out if you are exempt, and there's a process for doing that within the IRB. So basically, anybody who is going to be doing research with human subjects should ask themselves the questions from the beginning: do I need to get IRB approval? Now, within the different kinds of research that we conduct, there are three general categories that we can talk about when it comes to IRB review. Exempt review means that the research has extremely low risk and it fits some specific predetermined federal guidelines for categories that are exempt. categories that don't have to get IRB approval. Now, in general, though, they do still apply and apply for exempt status. So it's not like they didn't interact with the IRB committee at all. They just know they are in this special category. They apply for an exemption. They receive that exemption. Expedited means that the research has minimal risk, but it still requires a level of review from the committee. And then full board review is research that is more than minimal risk, and it gets the IRB's treatment of a full review. Now, exempt, like I said, doesn't mean that the researcher can skip the IRB. He or she still needs to apply, and the IRB committee is going to determine if that study if the study qualifies for an exemption. What does minimal risk mean? So we consider a study to be minimal risk when the probability and seriousness of harm are not greater than what you would encounter every day in your life through your routine activities. So it doesn't mean that there's no risk, but the risk that you see in the study is no more than what you would experience just living your day-to-day life. So some examples would be a survey that's very brief and short, right? So, cognitive tasks that are very standard, educational interventions that are simple, anonymous questionnaires, and maybe low-stress behavioral observations. For example, if I was going to go observe people's behavior at the entrance of a store at a mall, that might be considered minimal risk because I'm not interacting with the people. I'm simply observing their behavior at a certain point in a certain time. They may not even know that I'm there doing that, but I would still need to go to an IRB and get approval before I could go out and do the research. So what is more than minimal risk? Obviously, it's going to be something that is not expected for you to experience in an average day in your life. So activities in research that would imply more than minimal risk include anytime you're going to deprive people of sleep, okay? We've talked about some research where we've given an intervention after 4 hours, 6 hours, or 8 hours of sleep. Anything that would deprive them, or sleep deprivation being my independent variable, I would definitely need full review for that because it implies more than minimal risk. Something that increases anxiety or embarrassment, that would also be more than minimal risk. Anything with highly sensitive personal information, so if I was collecting information about diagnoses, where it be medical, like having HIV or AIDS, or your sexual behaviors, sexual preferences, or sexual history, or anything else related to maybe mental health, like have you been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, or something about the symptoms of depression or anxiety. Those would all imply more than minimal risk because those are sensitive topics, right? If there's deception that might cause distress in the participants, I'm going to classify that as more than minimal risk. And then anytime you're dealing with one of the several vulnerable populations that we've talked about within the context of ethics. So what is the IRB looking for exactly? They are focusing with risk, for example, to see that you, the researcher, are minimizing risk as much as possible wherever it is appropriate. And the second thing they're going to look at is the risk that is involved in this study, how does it compare to the potential value that the study could contribute back to science? Participant selection is one of the other things we talked about. So IRBs want to look and make sure that you are selecting your participants in a way that is fair and just. We're also going to talk about the informed consent and their rights, right? So the IRB is going to make sure that your consent procedures and your documents are clear, they're legible, you can read them, you can understand them, they're not complicated with additional jargon or things that don't need to be included in there. They're also going to look at the privacy and the confidentiality because private data and the participation in a research study need to be private, right? The whole world does not need to know that you are participating in a research study. And then once you've given answers as a participant, those answers have to be treated in a way that is confidential. I'm only going to share them with the people that need to know about it, and then it has to be agreed upon. A lot of informed consent documents will now, I've seen a lot more of this recently, they'll have a paragraph towards the end that says we may share this data for future studies. So what they want to do is keep your data and house it and take care of it and make sure it's safe, but they want to also treat that data as something they can come back to if there's a future research question that your data may be able to help. But they can't access that data unless they've obtained your permission. And the easiest way to do that is to get your permission at the time of the initial collection, rather than having to track all the participants down later on and saying, hey guys, we want to do this research, but we've already collected your data might help us. It's hard to do that. I mentioned to you earlier that IRBs want to look at the ability for a participant to withdraw. Withdrawal needs to be able to occur at any point in time. You can't say to your participants, okay, you can participate in this research and you can decide that you don't want to participate only at the beginning and midway through. No, they have to be able to say, I'm leaving, or not answer. They have the right to not answer any of the questions at any point in time. And you, the researcher, cannot penalize them. And what I mean by penalize is obviously there's not like civil penalties. I can't give them a ticket for leaving, but a lot of research studies use some sort of compensation, or you get a gift card or something along those lines. And the researcher can't take that away from you if you have already completed part of the study or whatever. There might be some partial compensation. It all just depends on the situation. But they can't penalize you. A professor couldn't come back and give you a 0 because you didn't participate in his research. As I mentioned earlier, there are some groups of people that are vulnerable and require additional protections. Those include pregnant women, children, people that have a mental disability or are incarcerated. All right. We talked about informed consent. I told you earlier that informed consent is not just getting permission. It means that the participants were fully informed and given information about the research so that they can make a decision to participate that is truly voluntary, and it's based on their own review of the procedures, the risks, etc. They're able to, in their mind, justify, well, hey, I want to participate. Here are the risks. Hey, I don't want to participate. Nah, whatever. So what comes in that process and that paper? Informed consent materials need to explain why the study is taking place, the purpose of it, exactly what the participants are going to do. If you're going to answer a survey, then it would list there, you'll be answering a 19-question survey after you wake up every morning for a week, okay? It'll tell the length of the participation. Are you going to be involved in this study one day and that's it? Or is data going to need to be collected over 30 days? Is it longitudinal? Am I going to ask you to come back and do this again in 6 months? Etc. The length of participation. Also, it's going to talk about the risks and benefits. It's also going to talk about any possible discomfort. By discomfort, it's just that feeling of discomfort, right? Maybe we're talking about topics that aren't exactly the easiest topics to talk about, like your sexual history. We want to talk about that up front so that participants are not surprised and so that they can make a thorough, informed choice to actually participate. Regarding participation, it's going to talk about that participation being voluntary, and it's going to often tell the participant, that it's voluntary and that it can't be held against them if they don't participate. We're going to talk about privacy and confidentiality, that we're not going to go around and tell people that you're participating and that your answers are confidential. They're between you and the researcher, and only the people who need to have access to that data are going to have access to it. we'll often talk about how your data will be de-identified, but we also talk about how statistical analysis will happen in aggregate. So that means as a group, it's going to be analyzed, not your particular results per se. It's also going to cover withdrawal procedures, and then important part is it's going to have information for you to contact, not just the researcher, but also the IRB, because there are times when you run into issues, unfortunately, with the researcher. Maybe they don't get back to you, or maybe you feel that they are doing something that is not right, not ethical. And so the IRB's contact information is included as well, because these are the guys that are giving the oversight of the research. So special considerations we have to look at for experiments. You have to make sure that your participants understand some of the basic parts of an experiment and how their participation is going to be used in that particular experimental design. So, for example, we've talked about how our manipulated independent variable exists. We may call that the treatment conditions, and participants have to be fully informed that there are different conditions. They may be assigned to a condition that receives the treatment, or they may be assigned to a condition that doesn't. So they have to understand that, and that often becomes important with health, especially like I was mentioning earlier, that vaccine study that I participated in. A lot of people were concerned about getting a vaccine because they wanted to be protected. So it was important for participants to understand that they may not actually be receiving a vaccine. They could be receiving a placebo. You also have to make sure that they understand that their experience might not be the same as others. Sometimes there are procedures that might include discomfort, stress, or simple inconvenience. The researcher needs to fully inform the participants of that, so that discomfort or stress does not take the participant by surprise. If a study is longitudinal, they may need to follow up over time or complete more activities or follow-up measures. So we want to make sure that they understand that this is longitudinal. It's not a one-and-done deal. They're going to have to come back or participate again, however the study is set up. The stopping without penalty is another thing people tend to have in their minds, once they start participating in something. Oh, I can't stop now. Well, in an informed consent situation, people understand that even though they may not want to, or they have this expectation that they have to continue because of the researcher, they truly are able to leave whenever they want. And then some study details are going to be withheld if deception is used. So sometimes some of these things that we just talked about up there might not be mentioned, and they can only not be mentioned in specific studies that are using deception. And obviously the IRB is going to focus on whether or not deception was essential in order to reach the study's goals. Privacy and confidentiality are extremely important. Researchers are going to kind of focus on how they're going to protect the participants' information and data once it's been given. Privacy refers to your right to control access to yourself and your personal information, and then confidentiality refers to how the researcher goes to protect that data after it's collected. Researchers have to explain if the data is going to be anonymous or identifiable. A lot of times, like I mentioned earlier, we will talk about how the data will be analyzed in aggregate and it will be de-identified. That means we're going to remove any identifiable markers from that file and put them together with all of the rest of the other participants, so that it becomes pretty impossible for you to pick one case and then figure out whose case that is, who that person is. Confidentiality, privacy and confidentiality also is important with concern to who is going to have access to that data. Obviously, we only want the researchers and people who are like the IRB board. They need ability to have access to that data, but we have to tell the participants about that. Data storage is important these days because, as you've probably all seen with companies, somebody is being hacked every other day, and data is being released on the dark web. So researchers have a duty to store that data in a way that is very, very, very responsible. And then most data has a limited research, a limited time that it's going to exist. So you might keep the study's data for 7 years, and then after those 7 years, the data is then destroyed. And then we're also going to talk about how when we go to report the data in a dissertation or in a thesis or in a journal article or whatever, we're going to report it without exposing individual participants. And I talked about earlier how that's by aggregation. Let's talk about deception and debriefing for a moment. We talked about how this can only be used in certain situations. Some experimental studies do use that, and some of the ways we do deception is by giving participants incomplete information about the purpose of the study. We tell them it's about one thing, but at the same time, we're looking at something else. We might use a cover story about a Confederate in the actual research itself. We might withhold our true hypothesis. We might tell them the hypothesis is X when it actually is Y. The Confederates that I talked about earlier, and then giving false feedback or staged information. So IRBs are going to review deception carefully because it can affect the informed consent process, and anytime that deception is used, debriefing has to occur, and that debriefing has to cover the purpose of the study, the true purpose, after participation, and provide any sort of assistance where needed. Now, special populations merit special protections, and some of these participants have limited power, limited autonomy, or an increased risk of self-harm. So we want to make sure that we hold our standard for protecting these groups to a higher bar. This could include children, prisoners, pregnant women, people with cognitive impairments, people experiencing severe illness or distress, or students, employees, or others who might feel some undue pressure that they must participate for whatever reason. So we have to be careful with that. IRBs are still going to consider whether or not their participation is truly voluntary and then decide what additional safeguards might be needed. So in an experimental research situation, we've got to make sure we pay special attention to this, because sometimes participants might feel like they can't withdraw, and they need to understand that they can withdraw, they can refuse to participate at any time, and there aren't going to be any consequences if they do. The general application process for the IRB is going to depend on the institution where the IRB is at. But the first thing that the researcher has to do is have a fully developed research question and study design. The reason why is you can't justify what you're going to do in your research if you don't have all of the details worked out beforehand. So you as a researcher have to make sure that your procedures and protocols have all been thought out and thoroughly developed before you begin the process of applying to the IRB. So that means you've got to make sure all your study materials are prepared. You have to have an informed consent. You have to have your recruitment materials developed. Recruitment means the IRB wants to see everything that has to do with all aspects of your study. So for recruitment, they want to see any emails that you would be sending out, any posters, any announcements, any social media posting drafts that you're going to have. And then they're also going to focus on the informed consent, because your informed consent's often going to list out your procedures. So the two things kind of develop together. As you're developing your procedures, pieces of those procedures are going to go into your informed consent documentation. And as you get towards the application process, you have fully developed your procedure and protocol. Once that's been done, you're generally going to complete an IRB application. Each IRB is going to kind of have their own form and their own packet, but in general, they're going to want multiple copies of your survey instruments, your informed consent document, especially any additional researcher developed tools. All of those have to have multiple copies put together in the packet. There's usually some sort of in-house form. You fill that out as well, and you kind of put it all together, and it's referred to in general as the IRB packet. That packet gets submitted. It may be old school, send it in, or online digitally, or it may be both. But after it's received by the IRB committee, the committee is going to meet and they're going to review your application. They may need to get in contact with you and have you respond, or they may request revisions or clarifications before they issue a decision. They may have a question about your procedures, or maybe you accidentally left something out or something was unclear. So they have the right to kind of come back and ask you to clarify stuff. After they have enough information, though, they're going to approve or give you an exemption, or they're going to not approve it and say, hey, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So you're going to need to get that declaration, because there's going to be like a number assigned to it, and you're going to need to make sure that the informed consent reflects that this has been reviewed and approved by an IRB, and here's the number, so that your participants can go back and refer to it if they need to contact the IRB board. So you can't begin your recruitment or your data collection until you get that approval, and it can be a long and frustrating process, but we have to respect that rule. While your research is going on, you have to maintain compliance. So depending on the kind of approval that you get, you may need to update your IRB committee. It could be a time issue with a yearly review, or it might happen because something happened in your study that you're required to disclose to the IRB as part of your approval. So earlier I mentioned some common things that they want to look at. These are common materials that they're going to want to see in that submission. They want to see your entire protocol, all recruitment materials. That includes scripts as well, what you're going to say to your participants verbally or in instructions. Obviously, all your data collection tools, surveys, questionnaires, measures, interview questions, how you're going to randomly assign your participants, how you're going to explain risks and benefits, how you're going to keep the data private and store it. If you're using deception, how your participants are going to be debriefed, permission letters, and then they're also going to look at certifications. So for particular, UHCL requires that you as a researcher have the city certification completed. And that certification is usually completed in my course, the 4370, but it might be completed through others as well. So the IRB can come back and make 3 basic decisions. They can approve it, and you can begin as you've described your study. They may approve it with modifications, which means you've got some changes to make before you can begin. They might defer. If they defer, that means there's some major revisions or additional info that they need before they can begin, or they can flat out not approve it and say, hey, you can't do this. And I hope that they would give feedback on why, but in any case, you can't recruit participants, collect data, or start the study until you have that official approval, no matter what these are. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the process doesn't end at approval. You, the researcher, may need to turn around and report unexpected problems, especially if there's participant harm, like, say, if you're doing a clinical trial or something that is involving the health of your participants. If something negative happens, you have an adverse event, somebody's allergic to something, or there's a reaction, you're going to have to approve that. If you need to make a significant change to your protocol, you're going to need to report that as well. And then you also have to participate in the ongoing review when that happens. You also have to keep accurate records, including consent forms and your other study documents. And when the study is closed, you need to close that study with the IRB so that they know that your study has ended. So what happens when things go wrong? Unfortunately, in the world of research, there are times when things go wrong, and we have to report those things to our IRB. Some examples of what we would need, when we would need to report, include if a participant experiences an unexpected distress, like I mentioned earlier, a reaction to something, if data are breached, and are no longer confidential if there's been hacking or data has been accessed by someone other than the people that were approved to have it. If we lose data or if somebody else gets a hold of it, if a participant reports that they were harmed from the study, if you get involved in the research and you find that there's a lot more risk than you expected, that has to be reported to the IRB. And then say you're going along and you find out that the approved procedures were not followed by someone else in the study, you've got to report that too. So reporting problems lets that IRB determine whether changes are needed in order to protect the people who are currently in the study or who will be involved in the study in the future. Now, at UHCL, we have an in-house IRB, and that's great because sometimes it can be really challenging to get approval from outside institutions. It's just a time-consuming process, and some IRBs charge money to actually review these protocols. Our internal review, UHCL's IRB follows the federal regulations, and it also adheres to the Nuremberg Code, the Belmont Report, and the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki. It meets every second Tuesday of the month. So as I told you earlier, it's not something that happens every day, so you've got to be prepared. And if you want more information, you can follow this link here, or you can actually go and just Google it and you'll find info about it. So that concludes the presentation on IRB. I hope you learned a little bit more than you didn't know beforehand. If you have any questions, reach out to me and have a wonderful day.